I would appreciate it if you could show your support by liking and subscribing to the video before you start watching. You're standing in the depths of Lascaux Cave 37,000 years ago. The flickering flames of your torch illuminate walls covered in creatures that seem to breathe in the dancing light. Massive aurochs, their horns spanning wider than your outstretched arms. Wild horses galloping across stone surfaces as if frozen mid-gallop. Cave lions prowling through painted shadows, their eyes following your every movement. But here's what we get wrong about our ancestors. We imagine them as ruthless killers, driven purely by hunger, seeing animals as nothing more than walking meat. We picture primitive humans sharpening spears with cold calculation, viewing the natural world as their personal grocery store. The truth is far more complex, far more spiritual, and far more human than we ever imagined. These weren't just hunters. They were believers. They were worshipers. They were participants in what may be humanity's oldest religious practice, a sacred relationship between predator and prey that governed every aspect of their lives. Before temples, before gods carved in stone, before written prayers, there was a hunt. And the hunt was holy. Archaeological evidence from over 200 sites across Europe, Asia, and the Americas tells us something extraordinary. Our ancestors didn't simply kill animals. They honored them, feared them, and believed that taking a life required divine permission. They painted their quarry on cave walls not as trophies, but as prayers. They performed elaborate rituals before every hunt, begging forgiveness from the spirits of the animals they were about to kill. This practice, known today as hunting totemism, may have shaped human consciousness for over 40,000 years. It governed when to hunt, how to hunt, and most importantly, why the animal spirits might allow themselves to be taken. It was a contract written in blood and reverence, a spiritual economy where every death demanded payment in ritual and respect. But here's the most shocking part. This wasn't superstition. This was survival. Because in a world where a failed hunt meant death, where a single wounded mammoth could destroy an entire clan, where the line between human and animal was razor thin, the spirits weren't just believed in, they were negotiated with, honored, and feared above all else. What we're about to uncover challenges everything we think we know about early human society, religion, and our relationship with nature. This is the story of when humans worshipped their food, when killing was an act of prayer, and when the hunt itself was humanity's first church. The evidence begins in the painted caves of France and Spain, where our ancestors created the world's first temples. At Chauvet Cave, 36,000 years ago, artists working by torchlight painted animals with such reverence that modern viewers report feeling spiritually moved by their presence. These weren't casual sketches. They were masterpieces created by professional artists who devoted their entire lives to depicting the sacred relationship between humans and animals. But the caves were just the beginning. Across the frozen steppes of Ice Age Europe, massive settlements organized around mammoth hunting created what can only be described as humanity's first religious civilization. At sites like Předmostí in the Czech Republic, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of permanent religious centers where hunters from across Europe gathered for ceremonies that lasted months. The sophistication of the system becomes clear when we examine its longevity. For over 25,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, this spiritual framework governed human relationships with the natural world. It survived ice ages, climate changes, and massive population movements while maintaining its essential characteristics across vast geographical distances. Professional shamans underwent decades of training to master the spiritual requirements of hunting. They developed sophisticated technologies for communicating with animal spirits, maintained detailed knowledge of sacred geography, and perform elaborate ceremonies that require precise timing and execution. These weren't desperate rituals performed by starving people. They were the products of complex theological systems that rivaled anything developed by agricultural civilizations. The tools themselves were sacred. Spear points from this period aren't just functional. They're beautiful, carved with intricate patterns, decorated with symbols that match the cave paintings. Each weapon took dozens of hours to create, suggesting that the act of making a hunting tool was itself a spiritual practice. Trade networks during this period weren't just economic, they were spiritual. Amber from the Baltic, shells from the Mediterranean, and obsidian from volcanic regions have been found at hunting sites thousands of miles from their origins. These materials weren't just valuable commodities. They were sacred substances required for proper hunting ceremonies, traded along networks that stretched across continents. But this golden age was built on a foundation that was already cracking. The ice was retreating. The megafauna were disappearing. And the spiritual contract that had sustained humanity for millennia was about to face its ultimate test. 12,000 years ago, the unthinkable happened. The animals stopped answering. The sacred hunt, which had governed human consciousness for 40,000 years, was about to experience its greatest crisis. What happened next would reshape human spirituality, create the foundation of every major religion, and leave an echo that still resonates in human consciousness today. Picture the Gravettian culture of Eastern Europe 28,000 years ago. These weren't desperate scavengers eking out a brutal existence. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dolny Vestinis reveals sophisticated societies with complex spiritual beliefs, intricate art, and most remarkably, elaborate burial practices. Not just for humans, but for animals. At the Mezin site in Ukraine, archaeologists discovered something that shattered our understanding of Ice Age humanity. Mammoth bones arranged in perfect circles, decorated with red ochre, surrounded by what can only be described as altars. But these weren't the remains of meals. Carbon dating revealed these bones had been collected over decades, curated like sacred relics, and arranged according to strict ceremonial patterns. Dr. Marshall Lebtov's analysis of bone fragments from across dozens of Paleolithic sites revealed a startling pattern. Certain bones showed evidence of careful preservation, special treatment with pigments, and deliberate arrangement. These people weren't just eating animals, she noted in her 2019 study. They were maintaining relationships with them that extended far beyond death. The evidence grows more compelling when we examine the cave paintings themselves. At Chalvik Cave, dated to 36,000 years ago, the walls tell a story that goes far beyond simple hunting scenes. The animals aren't depicted as prey. They're portrayed with an almost supernatural reverence. Cave lions are shown in profile, their manes flowing like divine energy. Rhinoceros charge across the stone with such power that visitors today report feeling intimidated by their presence. But the most telling evidence comes from the hunting tools themselves. Spear points from this period aren't just functional. They're beautiful, carved with intricate patterns, decorated with symbols that match the cave paintings. These weren't mass-produced weapons. Each spear point took dozens of hours to create, suggesting that the act of making a hunting tool was itself a spiritual practice. Archaeological evidence from the Sungur burial site in Russia reveals the ultimate proof of this sacred relationship. 2 children buried 34,000 years ago were interred wearing clothing decorated with over 13,000 ivory beads. But here's the crucial detail. Mixed among the human remains were the bones of Arctic fox, arranged in specific patterns, suggesting these animals have been ritually sacrificed to accompany the children into the afterlife. The ethnographic record from surviving hunter-gatherer cultures provides crucial context. The Inuit of the Arctic maintain hunting ceremonies that may be direct descendants of these ancient practices. Before hunting seal, traditional Inuit hunters performed the Sedna ceremony, asking the sea goddess for permission to take her creatures. The seal soul is honored with specific rituals, and failure to perform these ceremonies is believed to result in hunting failure and starvation. Similarly, the San people of the Kalahari maintain that every animal has an owner spirit that must be consulted before hunting. The unsuccessful hunter isn't just unlucky, he has failed to maintain proper spiritual relationships with the animal world. This wasn't primitive thinking. This was sophisticated theological reasoning. These cultures understood that in a world where humans were neither the largest nor the strongest predators, survival depended on something beyond physical prowess. It required cosmic permission. The complexity of this system becomes clear when we examine specific examples from the archaeological record. At the Pavlan Cave in Wales, the famous Red Lady burial reveals a 26,000-year-old ceremonial interment that included mammoth ivory rods, perforated shells, and most significantly, the remains of multiple animal species arranged in specific patterns around a human skeleton. Recent analysis using advanced DNA techniques has revealed that these animal remains came from creatures that weren't native to the local area. They have been transported from hundreds of miles away specifically for this burial ceremony. This suggests a spiritual system so sophisticated that it required international trade networks dedicated to obtaining proper ceremonial materials. The cave paintings themselves show evidence of repeated visits and ritual renewal. At Pech-Merle in France, painted handprints overlay animal figures and patterns that suggest ceremonial touching or blessing of the painted creatures. Chemical analysis of pigments reveals that some paintings were refreshed multiple times over thousands of years, indicating that these caves served as active religious sites for countless generations. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence comes from the treatment of cave bear remains found in association with human burials. Cave bears were among the most dangerous predators our ancestors faced, yet at sites across Europe, bear bones are found carefully arranged in human burial contexts, often in positions that suggest the bears were considered spiritual guardians or guides. The Drachenloch Cave in Switzerland contains evidence of what appears to be a cave bear skull shrine, with bear skulls arranged on stone platforms in patterns that mirror much later religious architecture. The careful positioning and preservation of these remains suggests our ancestors believed cave bears possessed spiritual power that could be accessed through proper ceremonial treatment. This evidence points to a fundamental truth about Ice Age spirituality. The boundary between human and animal consciousness was far more permeable than we imagine today. Our ancestors didn't see themselves as separate from the natural world. They saw themselves as participants in a cosmic community where animal spirits held equal or superior spiritual authority. 15,000 years ago, everything changed. The ice sheets were retreating, the megafauna were dying, and humanity faced its first existential crisis. The contract with the animal spirits was breaking down, and the consequences were about to rewrite the spiritual DNA of our species. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of desperation. At sites across Europe and North America, we find evidence of what researchers call kill sites, places where entire herds of animals were driven to their deaths. The Olsen Chubbuck site in Colorado reveals the remains of nearly 200 bison killed in a single coordinated hunt around 10,000 years ago. But here's what's chilling. There's no evidence of the careful butchering practices found at earlier sites. Many of the animals were left to rot. Dr. Paul Martin's Pleistocene overkill hypothesis suggests that human hunting pressure contributed to the extinction of dozens of megafauna species. But the spiritual implications go deeper than ecological disaster. Ethnographic studies of hunting cultures reveal that when the traditional prey animals disappear, the entire religious framework collapses. Check count, 184 words so far. The Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, isolated from mainland Australia for 12,000 years, provide a haunting parallel. Archaeological evidence shows they gradually abandoned hunting tools and techniques over millennia, eventually losing the ability to make fire and certain types of tools. But most significantly, their spiritual practices became increasingly focused on placating angry spirits rather than maintaining harmonious relationships. Rock art from this transitional period shows a dramatic shift in how humans depicted animals. The reverent, naturalistic paintings of the earlier caves give way to increasingly abstract, sometimes violent imagery. At the Tassili Eniger site in Algeria, paintings from 9,000 years ago show humans with bows confronting animal spirits that appear increasingly monstrous and threatening. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the emergence of human sacrifice during this period. At sites like Herxheim in Germany, archaeologists have found evidence of ritual cannibalism dating to 7,000 years ago. The bones show specific cut marks that suggest the victims were butchered according to ceremonial patterns previously reserved for sacred animals. The implication is terrifying. When the animal spirits could no longer be appeased through traditional hunting rituals, humans began offering their own kind. Mircea Eliade, the renowned historian of religion, argued that this crisis period saw the birth of what he called agriculture anxiety, the fear that the earth itself was dying, that the old relationships with nature were irreversibly broken. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Pottery from this period shows increasingly desperate attempts to recreate the sacred hunt through symbolic means. At the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey, dated to 11,000 years ago, massive stone pillars are carved with images of animals that were already extinct in the region. These weren't contemporary animals. They were memories, carved in stone as a desperate attempt to maintain contact with spirits that were no longer present in the physical world. The ethnographic record provides crucial insight into what this spiritual crisis would have felt like. When the traditional hunting grounds of the Mbuti people of Central Africa were destroyed by logging in the 20th century, anthropologist Colin Turnbull documented the complete breakdown of their social and religious systems. It wasn't just that they couldn't hunt, Turnbull observed. It was that their entire understanding of the universe had been invalidated. Traditional songs that had been used to call animal spirits were forgotten within a single generation. Shamanic practices that had maintained the balance between human and animal worlds were abandoned. The elders spoke of the silence, the absence of spiritual communication with the natural world that had previously defined their existence. This is what our ancestors faced 15,000 years ago: the silence of the animal spirits, the end of the sacred hunt, and the desperate need to find new ways to connect with the divine. Their solution would create the foundation of every major religion that followed. The transition wasn't immediate or universal. In isolated regions where traditional prey animals survived, hunting shamanism persisted. The Sami of Northern Europe, the Inuit of the Arctic, and various Siberian peoples maintained versions of the ancient practices into the modern era. But these were isolated remnants, cultural fossils preserved in environments that had changed less dramatically than the rest of the world. The majority of human societies face a choice: develop new spiritual systems based on agriculture and domestication, or face cultural extinction alongside the vanished megafauna. Most chose transformation, creating the foundation myths and religious practices that would dominate human civilization for the next 10,000 years. But this transformation came at a cost that we're only now beginning to understand. The sacred relationship between predator and prey which had governed human consciousness for 40 millennia, was severed. The ecological and spiritual consequences of this break would echo through every aspect of human culture that followed. Meet Tunrak, though that wasn't his real name. Real names held too much power to be spoken carelessly. Anthropologist Nud Rasmussen encountered him in 1924 on Aglulik Island, one of the last practicing hunting shamans of the traditional Inuit culture. At 93 years old, Tunrak had witnessed the final death throes of a spiritual tradition that had governed Arctic hunting for millennia. "The animals have souls," Tunrak told Rasmussen through an interpreter. "When we kill, we must ask the soul to forgive us. If we do not ask properly, the soul becomes angry. Angry souls call to their kin, and the animals hide from us. Then we starve." His hands, gnarled from decades of Arctic hunting, traced patterns in the air as he spoke, the same gestures his ancestors had used to communicate with animal spirits for countless generations. Rasmussen documented the elaborate preparation rituals Tunrak performed before each hunt, 3 days of fasting, during which the shaman would enter what he called the animal dreaming. In this altered state, Tunrak claimed he could communicate directly with the spirits of seals, walruses, and polar bears. He would negotiate the terms of the hunt. How many animals could be taken, which hunters were spiritually prepared to kill, and what offerings would be required to maintain the balance. But Tunrak wasn't alone. Archaeological evidence suggests that similar shamanic practitioners existed across the Arctic, Europe, and Siberia for tens of thousands of years. At the Shanidar cave site in Iraq, archaeologists discovered the 60,000-year-old burial of what appears to be a Neanderthal shaman, surrounded by the bones of cave bears and leopards arranged in specific patterns. Pollen analysis revealed the body had been buried with 8 different medicinal plants, suggesting sophisticated knowledge of both healing and spiritual practices. The most detailed evidence comes from the Sami people of northern Europe, whose hunting shamanism survived into the modern era. The Joik songs, traditional Sami spiritual chants, contain specific melodies for communicating with different animal spirits. Each species required its own musical approach. Deep, rhythmic chants for bears, high, quick notes for reindeer, haunting, wordless melodies for wolves. Lars Levi Lestadius, a 19th century ethnographer who lived among the Sami, documented hunting ceremonies that revealed the extraordinary complexity of this spiritual system. Before hunting reindeer, the shaman would perform what he called a soul calling, using traditional drum made from reindeer hide and painted with sacred symbols. The shaman would enter a trance state and journey to what the Sami called Sapmi, the spirit world where animal souls resided. "I have seen the shaman's body become completely rigid," Lestadius wrote in 1845. "His breathing nearly stops, his eyes roll back, and for hours he travels in the spirit world. When he returns, he knows exactly where the reindeer herds can be found, how many can be taken, and which hunters must perform additional purification rituals." But these shamanic journeys came with enormous personal cost. Traditional accounts describe shamans aging rapidly, their life force gradually consumed by their spiritual responsibilities. The Siberian event people spoke of shamans who died young, eaten by the spirits they served. Yet communities considered these sacrifices essential for survival. The psychological anthropologist Richard Katz lived with the Kung people of the Kalahari in the 1960s and witnessed similar hunting ceremonies. The Kung healers described entering what they called Kia, a trance state induced by intense dancing and breathing techniques. In Kia, the healers claimed they could see the threads connecting all living beings, understanding exactly when and where hunting would maintain rather than disturb the cosmic balance. It's not just about finding animals, 1. Kung Healer explained to cats. Any fool can track animals. The healer must know when the animal spirits are willing to give themselves, when taking a life serves the greater pattern rather than breaking it. The ethnographic evidence reveals that these hunting shamans developed sophisticated psychological techniques for managing the moral trauma of killing. They understood that successful hunters risked what we might now call PTSD, the psychological breakdown that comes from repeatedly taking life. The shamanic rituals weren't just about communicating with spirits. They were therapeutic practices for processing the emotional consequences of necessary violence. But by the 1920s, when Rasmussen met Tunrak, this ancient system was collapsing. Christian missionaries, colonial governments, and modern hunting methods were destroying the cultural context that made shamanic hunting possible. Tunrak was one of the last humans to maintain the 40,000-year-old contract between predator and prey. The young ones use guns now. Tunrak told Rasmussen near the end of their conversations. They think bullets are stronger than prayers. But they do not understand. When the last shaman dies, the animals will remember. They will hide forever, and the people will starve with full bellies. His prediction would prove more accurate than anyone could have imagined. As traditional hunting shamanism died out across the globe, humanity would face an entirely new kind of starvation, not physical but spiritual. The loss of conscious relationship with animal intelligence would create an existential wound that industrial civilization still struggles to heal. Between 40,000 and 15,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, the sacred hunt reached its most sophisticated expression. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was humanity's first complex theological system, complete with professional clergy, elaborate temples, and international trade networks dedicated to spiritual practice. The Gravettian culture, stretching from Portugal to Siberia, created what can only be described as a hunting-based civilization. At sites like Predmosty in the Czech Republic, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of settlements housing up to 1,000 people, all organized around the spiritual requirements of mammoth hunting. These weren't temporary camps. These were permanent religious centers where hunters from across Europe gathered for ceremonies that lasted months. The scale of these operations was staggering. At Predmosty alone, the remains of over 1,000 mammoths have been found, along with evidence of elaborate processing areas where every part of the animal was used according to strict spiritual protocols. Mammoth bones formed a framework of massive structures that served as both temples and storage facilities. Mammoth ivory was carved into intricate sculptures that researchers believe served as spiritual totems, connecting hunters across vast distances. Dr. Yuri Svoboda's excavations revealed the most extraordinary evidence of all, a mammoth bone library containing over 200 carved ivory pieces, each decorated with symbols that appear across multiple sites throughout Europe. These weren't random decorations. They were elements of a coherent symbolic system, a written language of the sacred hunt that allowed spiritual practitioners to share knowledge across thousands of miles. The Venus figurines, found at dozens of sites across Europe, take on new meaning when viewed through this lens. These aren't simply fertility symbols. Many show evidence of careful modification and ritual use that suggests they were spiritual tools used in hunting ceremonies. The Venus of Dolny Vestinus shows where patterns consistent with repeated handling during ritual activities, and traces of red ochre suggest it was regularly anointed with sacred pigments. But the most compelling evidence comes from the cave art itself. At Lascaux, Chauvet, and Altamira, the paintings reveal a level of artistic sophistication that rivals anything produced in human history. These weren't casual sketches. They were masterpieces created by professional artists who devoted their entire lives to depicting the sacred relationship between humans and animals. The positioning of the cave paintings follows consistent patterns across different sites. Animals are placed in locations where acoustic properties would amplify sound, suggesting the caves were designed as ceremonial spaces where hunting rituals were performed. At Chalvet, sound tests reveal that certain painted areas produce remarkable echoes, turning the cave into a natural cathedral. Archaeological evidence suggests these caves were pilgrimage destinations. Tool fragments from hundreds of miles away have been found at major cave art sites, indicating that hunters traveled vast distances to participate in ceremonies. Where patterns on the cave floors show heavy foot traffic concentrated around specific painted areas, suggesting repeated ritual use over thousands of years. The Magdalenian culture, which succeeded the Gravettians, refined the system to its ultimate expression. At Altamira, dated to 14,000 years ago, the cave paintings show animals rendered with such anatomical precision that modern veterinarians use them as teaching tools. But this accuracy wasn't just artistic skill. It represented intimate spiritual knowledge of animal anatomy, behavior, and life cycles. Ethnographic parallels help us understand how this system functioned. The Paleo-Siberian peoples maintained hunting ceremonies well into the 20th century that may directly descend from Ice Age practices. Among the Even people of Siberia, hunters underwent decades of training to master the spiritual requirements of hunting. Young hunters weren't allowed to kill major prey until they had demonstrated mastery of the ceremonial protocols. The training involved memorizing hundreds of songs, learning the spiritual genealogies of different animal families, and developing the ability to enter trance states for communication with animal spirits. Master hunters were revered figures who held authority comparable to political leaders in agricultural societies. Trade networks during this period weren't just economic, they were spiritual. Amber from the Baltic, shells from the Mediterranean, and obsidian from volcanic regions have been found at hunting sites thousands of miles from their origins. These materials weren't just valuable commodities. They were sacred substances required for proper hunting ceremonies, traded along networks that stretched across continents. The sophistication of the system becomes clear when we consider its longevity. For over 25,000 years, longer than all of recorded human history, the spiritual framework governed human relationships with the natural world. It survived ice ages, climate changes, and massive population movements, while maintaining its essential characteristics across vast geographical distances. But this golden age was built on a foundation that was already cracking. The ice was retreating, the megafauna were disappearing, and the spiritual contract that had sustained humanity for millennia was about to face its ultimate test. The question wasn't whether the system would survive, it was whether humanity would. 12,000 years ago, the unthinkable happened. The animals stopped answering. At sites across North America, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of what they call the Pleistocene extinction event, the sudden disappearance of 35 genera of large mammals within a span of just 2,000 years. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, cave bears, creatures that had shared the planet with humans for millennia simply vanished from the archaeological record. But the spiritual implications went far deeper than ecological collapse. At the Blackwater Draw site in New Mexico, the final Clovis culture layers tell a story of desperate innovation. The famous Clovis points, among the most beautiful stone tools ever created, become increasingly elaborate in their final iterations. These weren't improvements in hunting technology. They were desperate attempts to create tools powerful enough to restore communication with departing spirits. The Folsom culture that followed shows clear signs of spiritual crisis. Rock art from this period depicts humans in increasingly desperate poses, arms raised to empty skies. facing animals that appear to be dissolving or fleeing. At the Hell Gap site in Wyoming, archaeologists found evidence of mass tool caches buried in ceremonial patterns, as if entire communities were offering their most precious hunting implements to gods who had stopped listening. Dr. Paul Martin's analysis of extinction patterns reveals the terrifying scope of this collapse. In North America, 73% of megafauna genera disappeared. In South America, 83%. In Australia, where human arrival coincided with similar extinctions, the percentage reached 88%. These weren't gradual environmental changes. These were sudden, catastrophic collapses that left entire ecosystems barren. The human response was documented in surviving oral traditions that anthropologists are only now beginning to understand. Among the Cherokee, the story of when the animals left describes a time when the spirits of deer, bear, and buffalo decided humans had broken the ancient agreements. In these stories, the animal spirits held council and decided to withdraw their gift of life, leaving humans to survive through agriculture and domestication. Similar stories exist across Native American cultures. The Lakotas speak of the Great Forgetting, when humans lost the ability to communicate with animal spirits. The Ojibwe describe the silent time, when the dream songs that called animals to hunters simply stopped working. These aren't metaphorical stories. They're cultural memories of actual spiritual practices that ceased to function. Archaeological evidence supports these oral traditions. At Catalhuyuk in Turkey, dated to 9,000 years ago, wall paintings show a dramatic shift from hunting scenes to agricultural imagery. But more telling are the images that show humans attempting to perform traditional hunting ceremonies around domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, and goats arranged in patterns that mirror earlier cave paintings of wild aurochs and deer. The psychological impact on hunting cultures was devastating. Ethnographic studies of the Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, who lost contact with mainland Australian hunting traditions 12,000 years ago, reveal how quickly sophisticated spiritual systems can collapse when their ecological foundations disappear. Within a few generations, complex ceremonies were reduced to fragmentary rituals whose original meanings were forgotten. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the emergence of what anthropologists call substitution sacrifice. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, human remains from this period show evidence of ritual treatment previously reserved for sacred animals. The implication is chilling. When animal spirits could no longer be contacted through traditional means, humans began offering their own kind as substitutes. At the Herxheim site in Germany, 7,000 years old, archaeologists found the remains of over 500 humans who had been ritually butchered according to patterns that exactly match earlier practices used on mammoth and aurochs. The bones show specific cut marks, marrow extraction, and even evidence that the skulls were used as ceremonial bowls, all practices documented in earlier animal hunting ceremonies. The transition wasn't immediate or universal. In isolated regions where traditional prey animals survived, hunting shamanism persisted. The Sami of Northern Europe, the Inuit of the Arctic, and various Siberian peoples maintained versions of the ancient practices into the modern era. But these were isolated remnants, cultural fossils preserved in environments that had changed less dramatically than the rest of the world. The majority of human societies faced a choice: develop new spiritual systems based on agriculture and domestication, or face cultural extinction alongside the vanished megafauna. Most chose transformation, creating the foundation myths and religious practices that would dominate human civilization for the next 10,000 years. But this transformation came at a cost that we're only now beginning to understand. The sacred relationship between predator and prey, which had governed human consciousness for 40 millennia, was severed. The ecological and spiritual consequences of this break would echo through every aspect of human culture that followed. The mechanics of Ice Age hunting shamanism were far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. These weren't simple rituals performed by desperate people. They were precise spiritual technologies developed over millennia to maintain communication between human and animal consciousness. At the heart of this system lay the sacred geography of hunting grounds. Every landscape was mapped not just physically, but spiritually. The Sami people of northern Europe maintained detailed knowledge of what they called the invisible country, a parallel realm where animal spirits resided, accessible through specific locations and ceremonies. Archaeological evidence suggests the system is ancient beyond measure. At the Lascaux Cave complex, recent discoveries have revealed chambers that were never meant for human habitation. These deep recesses, accessible only by crawling through narrow passages, contain paintings visible only by torchlight, depicting animals in states that suggest dream or trance imagery. Acoustic analysis reveals these chambers amplify sound in specific frequency ranges that match documented shamanic drumming patterns. Dr. Igor Reznikov's pioneering work in cave acoustics has shown that Paleolithic painters deliberately chose locations with optimal sound properties. At Chalvet, painted horses are positioned at points where a human voice produces remarkable multi-tone echoes. At Fontagaume, bison paintings align with areas where rhythmic clapping creates resonance patterns that match traditional shamanic drumming. The technology of trance induction was equally sophisticated. Ethnographic studies of surviving hunting shamans revealed techniques for altering consciousness that required years of training to master. Among the Siberian Evenk, apprentice shamans underwent decade-long initiations that included sensory deprivation, controlled breathing techniques, and the use of psychoactive substances derived from reindeer urine and fly agaric mushrooms. But the most crucial element was a drum, not just a musical instrument, but a spiritual vehicle for traveling between worlds. Traditional shamanic drums were constructed according to precise specifications that have been passed down unchanged for generations. The hide came from specific animals, killed during particular seasons, prepared using methods that took months to complete. The Sami Noidi shamans described their drums as living beings with their own consciousness. Each drum was painted with symbols that served as a map of the spirit world, pathways between the human realm and the domain of animal spirits. Archaeological evidence from drum fragments found across northern Europe shows remarkable consistency in these symbolic systems, suggesting a shared spiritual technology that spanned vast distances. The process of spirit calling followed precise protocols that varied depending on the target species. For reindeer, Sami shamans used specific drumbeat patterns that mimicked the sound of hooves on frozen ground. For bears, deeper, slower rhythms were employed, often accompanied by guttural vocalizations that imitated bear calls. Each species required its own approach, its own spiritual language. Hunting tools themselves were integral to the system. Spear points weren't just weapons. They were ritual objects that had to be consecrated before use. Among the Inuit, each hunter maintained a personal relationship with his hunting implements, speaking to them, caring for them, and performing ceremonies to ensure they would kill cleanly and compassionately. The Paleolithic spear points found at sites like Sauter in France show evidence of elaborate decoration that served no practical hunting purpose. These weren't displays of artistic skill. They were spiritual inscriptions, symbols that connected the weapon to the cosmic order of the hunt. Each point was unique, suggesting that hunters created personalized spiritual relationships with their tools. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this technology was its system of spiritual accounting. Every successful hunt created what anthropologists call spiritual debt that had to be repaid through elaborate ceremonies. The larger the animal, the greater the debt. Among the Inuit, the killing of a walrus required ceremonies that lasted for days, with specific offerings made to Sedna, the sea goddess who controlled marine mammal spirits. This accounting system extended beyond individual hunts to encompass entire seasons and years. Traditional hunting cultures maintain careful records of how many animals have been taken from each species, when spiritual debts were accumulating, and which ceremonies were required to maintain balance. The archaeological record shows evidence of seasonal gathering sites where multiple hunting groups would come together to perform collective ceremonies designed to address accumulated spiritual obligations. The complexity of the system becomes clear when we examine its failure mechanisms. Ethnographic accounts from disrupted hunting cultures reveal that the breakdown of any single element, the loss of proper drums, the death of experienced shamans, the disappearance of traditional prey animals, could cause the entire system to collapse within a generation. This wasn't primitive thinking. It was sophisticated systems theory applied to the problem of sustainable predation. These cultures understood that in an ecosystem where humans were both predators and prey, survival required more than physical prowess. It demanded a technology for maintaining conscious relationships with non-human intelligence. By 8,000 years ago, the impossible had become reality. The voices of the animal spirits, which had guided human consciousness for 40 millennia, had fallen silent. The last generation of hunting shamans found themselves performing ceremonies to gods who no longer answered, maintaining rituals for relationships that had been severed forever. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, the archaeological evidence of this spiritual catastrophe is carved in stone. The massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing 16 tons each, are covered with images of animals that were already extinct in the region when the monument was built. These weren't contemporary animals. They were memories. Lions, boars, aurochs, and birds of prey that had vanished from the local ecosystem were depicted with obsessive detail, as if the very act of carving could call their spirits back to the world. Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations at Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014, described the site as humanity's first temple complex. But the evidence suggests something more desperate. This was a massive effort to restore broken communication with the animal spirit world. The site required coordinating hundreds of workers over decades, mobilizing resources on a scale never before attempted by hunter-gatherer societies. But the most telling evidence comes from the deliberate burial of the entire complex around 8,000 years ago. The builders didn't abandon Göbekli Tepe. They carefully filled it with tons of earth and stone, sealing it as if it were a tomb. Recent excavations have revealed that this burial was ceremonial, accompanied by ritual deposits that suggest the builders were performing funeral rites for their own spiritual tradition. Across Europe, similar evidence points to the same conclusion. The cave art tradition, which had flourished for over 25,000 years, suddenly ended around 10,000 years ago. The last paintings at sites like La Paisiega in Spain show increasingly abstract, desperate imagery. Human figures reaching toward animal spirits that appear to be dissolving into geometric patterns. The psychological impact on surviving hunting cultures was documented in oral traditions that persisted for millennia. The Ainu people of Japan maintained stories of the Great Forgetting, when the Kamui animal spirits retreated to an invisible world that humans could no longer access. These weren't metaphorical tales. They were precise descriptions of specific ceremonial failures. According to Ainu tradition, the last shaman spent years attempting to restore contact with their spirits using increasingly desperate measures. They performed ceremonies of unprecedented length and complexity, offered sacrifices on scales never before attempted, and even began experimenting with human sacrifice when traditional animal offerings failed to produce results. The failure of these efforts created what anthropologists call spiritual trauma, a collective psychological wound that affected entire populations. Among the Siberian Nenets, oral traditions describe a period called the Silent Time, when reindeer spirits stopped communicating with human hunters. Traditional songs that called reindeer for generations simply stopped working, forcing communities to develop entirely new hunting strategies based on tracking and trapping rather than spiritual communication. But the most devastating evidence comes from the emergence of what researchers call substitute hunting, attempts to recreate the sacred hunt using domestic animals. At early agricultural sites across the Middle East, archaeologists have found evidence of elaborate ceremonies involving the ritual slaughter of cattle, sheep, and goats arranged in patterns that exactly mirror earlier cave paintings of wild aurochs and deer. These ceremonies represent humanity's desperate attempt to maintain the spiritual technology of the sacred hunt in a world where the original prey animals no longer existed. Domestic animals were killed according to ancient protocols, their bones arranged in traditional patterns, their blood offered to spirits that were no longer present to receive it. The transition wasn't immediate. In regions where traditional prey animals survived in reduced numbers, simplified versions of hunting shamanism persisted. But even these remnants showed clear signs of degradation. The elaborate ceremonies that had once lasted for days were compressed into brief rituals. The complex negotiations with animal spirits were replaced by simple requests for hunting luck. Dr. Roberta Urvitay's analysis of Mesolithic sites across Europe reveals the archaeology of spiritual collapse. Tool caches buried at sites like Starcar in England show hunters abandoning increasingly elaborate hunting implements, as if the objects themselves had lost their spiritual power. The careful curation of animal bones, which had characterized Paleolithic sites for millennia, disappears from the archaeological record. Most telling of all is the emergence of foundation sacrifice, the practice of burying humans or animals under the foundations of new buildings. This practice, which appears simultaneously across multiple cultures around 7,000 years ago, represents a desperate attempt to restore the old spiritual contracts using new methods. If animal spirits would no longer consent to be hunted, perhaps they could be forced to remain through sacrifice and entombment. The Neolithic Revolution wasn't just the adoption of agriculture. It was humanity's response to the greatest spiritual crisis in our species' history. Farming and animal domestication were survival strategies developed by cultures that had lost their primary means of communicating with the natural world. In 1910, anthropologist Alfred Kroeber made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of hunting shamanism's final moments. In a slaughterhouse corral near Oroville, California, he found Ishi, the last surviving member of the Yai people, and quite possibly the last Stone Age hunter in North America. Ishi had spent his entire life practicing hunting techniques unchanged for thousands of years. When Kroeber brought him to University of California, Ishi demonstrated skills that revealed the extraordinary sophistication of traditional hunting culture. His arrows were works of art, each one requiring 4 hours to complete, crafted according to spiritual requirements that governed everything from the type of wood used to the precise angle of the fletching. But more importantly, Ishi maintained the spiritual practices that had governed hunting for millennia. Before making arrows, he performed purification ceremonies. Before hunting, he sang specific songs to communicate with deer spirits. When he killed an animal, he performed rituals of gratitude and apology that his people had practiced for countless generations. Dr. Saxton Pope, who studied Ishi's hunting methods, wrote, "He possessed a knowledge of animal habits that seemed almost supernatural. He could predict where deer would appear, when they would move, and how they would react to pursuit with an accuracy that defied explanation. What Pope was witnessing were the remnants of the 40,000-year-old system of spiritual communication with animal consciousness. But Ishi was already a ghost from a dead world. His tribe had been hunted to extinction by European settlers, and he was the sole survivor of a way of life that had governed human existence since the Ice Age. When he died in 1916, the last direct link to humanity's original spiritual technology died with him. Similar final witnesses were documented across the globe. In Tasmania, Truganini, the last full-blooded Tasmanian Aboriginal woman, died in 1876, taking with her the final memories of hunting ceremonies that had persisted for over 40,000 years. Her people had been the longest surviving Stone Age culture on Earth, isolated from the rest of humanity for 12 millennia, maintaining spiritual practices that were older than agriculture, older than written language, older than any other human tradition. Before her death, Truganini described hunting ceremonies to ethnographer George Augustus Robinson that revealed the incredible complexity of the spiritual system her people had maintained. Each species of animal required specific approach rituals. Kangaroo hunting involved 3 days of purification, during which hunters could not touch their wives or eat certain foods. Seal hunting required negotiation with water spirits through song cycles that lasted for hours. The old people knew how to speak with the animals. Truganini told Robinson they could call the kangaroo by singing, call the seals by dancing. But when the white men came, the animals stopped listening. Now we are all alone. In the Arctic, the last traditional Inuit shamans were documented by anthropologist Nud Rasmussen during his Fifthuli expedition in the 1920s. These practitioners maintained hunting ceremonies that were direct descendants of Ice Age spiritual technology. Before hunting walrus, shamans would enter trance states and journey to the underwater realm of Sedna, the sea goddess who controlled all marine mammals. Rasmussen recorded the account of Aue, an elderly shaman from Aglulik, who described the collapse of traditional hunting magic. The spirits no longer come when we call them. The young men use rifles now, and the spirits fear the noise. They hide in places we cannot reach, and our songs have no power over them. But perhaps the most poignant documentation comes from the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, where the last hunting shamans were recorded by anthropologist A.R. Radcliffe Brown in the early 1900s. The Andamanese had been isolated for potentially 60,000 years, maintaining hunting traditions that might have been the purest surviving examples of Paleolithic spiritual practice. Their hunting ceremonies involved direct communication, what they called the dream spirits of various animals. Before hunting pig, the shamans would spend days in the forest, sleeping in locations where pig spirits were believed to gather. In dreams, they would negotiate with the pig spirits, asking permission to take specific animals and promising proper treatment of their remains. The last Andamanese shaman, a man known as Jiraki, demonstrated these dream hunting techniques for Radcliffe Brown. Jiraki would lie motionless for hours, claiming to be traveling in the spirit world. When he awakened, he would lead hunters directly to locations where animals could be found, often predicting not just their location but their number and behavior with uncanny accuracy. It is not magic, Jiraki told Radcliffe Brown through an interpreter. It is conversation. The spirits speak to those who know how to listen, but fewer and fewer know the language, and soon there will be silence forever. The tragedy of these final witnesses lies not just in their deaths, but in the impossibility of transmission. The spiritual technology they carried required lifelong training, cultural context, and most importantly, living relationships with animal spirits that had already withdrawn from most of the world. By 1950, the last practitioners of traditional hunting shamanism had died or been converted to modern religions. The 40,000-year-old system of human-animal spiritual communication had finally ended, not through dramatic catastrophe, but through quiet extinction in remote corners of the world where the old ways had lingered longest. Walk into any modern cathedral, mosque, or temple, and you're witnessing the ghosts of the sacred hunt, the soaring architecture, the carefully orchestrated rituals, the belief that divine communication requires specific places and practices. All of this descends directly from Ice Age hunting ceremonies performed in painted caves 40,000 years ago. But the echoes go deeper than formal religion. Every time a hunter whispers sorry to a deer he's killed, every time a fisherman throws back the first fish of the day, every time someone feels guilty about eating meat, these are genetic memories of the sacred contract between predator and prey that govern human consciousness for 90% of our species' history. Modern environmental movements, with their emphasis on sustainable relationships with nature, are attempting to restore principles that hunting shamans took for granted. The idea that humans have responsibilities to animal consciousness, that taking life requires spiritual justification, that the natural world possesses agency and intelligence that must be respected, these aren't new concepts. They're the oldest human ideas, buried under 10,000 years of agricultural civilization, but never completely forgotten. Recent advances in animal cognition research are revealing that the Ice Age shamans may have been more scientifically accurate than we imagined. Studies showing complex emotional lives in mammals, sophisticated communication systems in various species, and even possible forms of animal spirituality suggest that the shamanic belief in animal consciousness wasn't primitive superstition. It was sophisticated observation of real phenomena. The sacred hunt didn't disappear. It transformed. The same human need for a spiritual relationship with non-human intelligence that once drove hunters to paint caves and perform elaborate ceremonies now drives us to protect endangered species, study animal behavior, and search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're still seeking the sacred relationship with the other that our ancestors maintained for 40 millennia. This wasn't just about hunting. It was about consciousness itself. The recognition that intelligence exists throughout the natural world, that spiritual relationship transcends species boundaries, and that taking life requires more than physical power. It requires permission, gratitude, and the willingness to be held accountable by non-human intelligence. Even today, in our concrete cities and digital worlds, the sacred hunt still echoes.